thing, your name, when I read your bio and some of the sections of your book, events are a big part of your life, and I grew up in a generation where this goes back to George Harrison and Bangladesh and people, which might have been a great event. I know it was a great album, but it's but I know, and I have it in my phone. But but that evolution of celebrities and famous people in the arts, literature, yes, some people in politics, movies, TV, whatever, coming to the aid of these causes, you find that that's still a going concern?
Yeah, look, and we spoke about this before, and I think Live Aid and, anyone that watches that, my parents, my parents were British expats growing up in Australia, and they spoke about the power of that in the UK and in Philadelphia, George Harrison's concert for Bangladesh, and it convinced a whole generation that they can make a difference. I guess what we tried to stand on the shoulders of those giants, but turn it on its head, is, after I left college, we got involved in charitable endeavors. We would raise $1,000. I went round to my local shopping center, we'd get all this free stuff, we would do quiz nights, we would donate thousands of dollars to help build schools. And then when we would go to these communities, you'd realize, okay, it's great we built the bricks for the schools, but who's paying the teacher's salary 365 days a year? Who's paying to put meals on the table of these children? And it's often the only meal they get. And then who is making sure that basically that if a child gets sick or their parent gets sick, that there's hospitals that they can go through. And then you amplify that across all these communities, and you realize that no amount of gala night dinner is going to raise the billions needed to end extreme poverty. Nelson Mandela once said that poverty is not natural. Like apartheid and slavery, it can be eradicated by the actions of human beings. And so quickly from there, we were like, wow, we need a social movement. And what we realized, this guy, Ryan Gore, who was this gentleman in California, reached out, had this great idea. He said, rather than charging people for tickets, right, to your events, why don't you give them away for free, but in return for people taking action? So we developed this app, people would download it, they would take action, they would use their points, they would accrue these points, and then they could go and draw to win a ticket. And so that became the model of the Global Citizen Festival. We've done it every year, with the exception of 2020, on the great lawn of Central Park. It's happened in September 28th this year. We have Post Malone, Chris Martin, Hugh Jackman, the great Jane Goodall, and we've mobilized over 33 million citizen actions since then. It's helped in some shape or form unlock $40 billion to help incredible organizations around the world. So that was our, I guess, take on popular culture.
Great. The event is the 28th. That's a Saturday, or
28th? Yeah,
that's a Saturday.
Still
the 28th
tickets available.
And where do you get tickets online?
Yeah, Global Citizen. You can download the app, take action. It's all available. Yeah.
And you have tickets. They have space there. I forgot. I'm so old now. I forgot how many spaces.
60,000.
60,000 can fit into Central Park.
We could fit more, but then we may not be invited back.
Right. That does happen. Now, we have a couple more questions for him that I'm told we're going to take some questions from the audience, or no? Is that correct? We doing that? Okay, great. So, well, I was in France during when the environmental conference was with the attack at the nightclub, the name of which is escaping me.
Yeah, in
2015, I was there, and I was supposed to be part of a group of people with the United Nations Development Program, UNDP, which eventually that was folded into, I think, UNEP. But I was there with a group of people to present the Equator Prize, which was these 33 awards that were given to different countries where they had done all this great work in stewardship of the rainforest or whatever their forested areas were. Some places like you wouldn't believe there's a forest in Afghanistan, but there is a forest. There's a not-for-profit that protects the forest, a very thin strip of land, several thousand acres in Afghanistan. Belize has a very small, but the people from Belize showed up to get their award, and it was supposed to be me and a handful of other people. James Cameron, the famous film director, who's a big environmentalist. We were all going to show up and give these prizes. Well, then nobody shows up because of the attack. Yeah. I'm the only one that comes. Because based on my experience, the safest time to go to Paris is right after the attack. There was people with rifles on every corner. The military was everywhere. So I go to the event. I was supposed to be one of a group of like 6 people giving these awards. But instead, it's me coming on stage every 3 minutes going, me again, to give the award to this country and that country and this country. So, but that program where you're bolstering you're trying to you're trying to encourage that kind of work around the world. The problem, and again, I don't have any fresh language here, but the problem is the global nature of this problem. And how do we, as a country that is a leader, because when we were there, the United States opted out of the conference, they opted out of the agreement, which was really, really tough and very painful for everybody that I was there with. They were very, very hopeful. What do you think is the thing that can most help leverage pressure on the government? I don't expect you to have an answer to all these things, but you're so well versed in all this stuff that can help leverage pressure on the U.S. government for the United States to resume that leadership position in terms of global warming worldwide.
You know, I love that word you used, leverage, and I speak about this in the book. I once heard this slogan. It went. Someone said, no one can do everything, but everyone can do something, right? And I genuinely believe when it comes to these big challenges, the thing we have to look at is, what can we do? What's our shortfalls? What's our strengths? And, you know, I remember being at the 2021 climate conference in Glasgow, and it was just after the pandemic, and there were thousands of people trying to get into this conference, right? And I was at the back, because they tend to put all the government people in one area, all the non-profit NGO, the people who they don't think matters in another. So we're in this long line, right? And these two activists started like getting in this fight with one another. And one of these activists said to the other, they said, hold on a sec, we're out here, all of us, and we're competing to get in the same room for the same audience, for the same media interviews, for the same donor attention, and actually, are we having an impact? And the other person eventually acknowledged this, and sure enough, once you went into the conference center, there were all these side events, people having these panel discussions, and literally there was two people in front of every single audience, right? And usually it was like their friends or someone else, that was it. And you just thought, what are we all doing here? And so the thing I love about like the Hampton International Film Festival, and even your own background and organizations you're involved in, and we were talking a little bit about your advocacy on issues of nuclear energy over the years, is that we all have platforms. We either have platforms and we can look at how we leverage those platforms to contribute, and the power of popular culture is one area. Like if you can do a documentary or film, you could reach far more people, and it would probably be far less painless than trying to do an event at the UN that two people rock up in order to move hearts and minds. And then I think the second thing to recognize is if you don't have a platform, how you can ask and leverage the platform of others. I always remember in 2018, this isn't to do with climate change, but it gets into the point you mentioned. We were doing this big festival. We were invited by the government of Nelson Mandela to go to South Africa. And we announced it. We had Beyonce, we had Jay-Z, we had Oprah Winfrey. Like, you know, it was massive. And we announced this, and it was 3 hashtags that was trending. One was Mandela 100. One was Beyonce. Everyone loves Beyonce, so of course. And then the third one was this hashtag called It's Bloody Time. And I thought, that's not our campaign. And people were like, some of our team were upset. They said, who's this hijacking our launch here? So I went out and I met these young female advocates. And these advocates were amazing. And they told me about the fact, no, we're hijacking your platform, or we're asking you to make this your priority. And they said it's outrageous that in our country, some girls lose up to 60 days of school a year because they lack access to period products. And I remember this young woman, and it stuck with me. She introduced herself as the Minister for Menstruation. And I said, is that a formal government title? Like, are you actually the minister appointed by the president? And she said, no, I looked at the government, they didn't have anyone, I asked them to appoint it, and after a while I just went out and I took the job myself. And I created it myself. And she was on a mission to make these period products, which in some countries are still taxed as a luxury good, to get them tax exempt. And we made this, some ministers said, you can't make this your theme, this is not a issue worthy of Mandela. But these young women, they convinced us, and we had the record number of people tweeting, phoning, petitioning. I still remember that same minister, when they slapped down the petition on his desk, the whole table shook. And sure enough, after we got the pledge, and the president literally came along, made it on that stage in Johannesburg with the likes of Oprah, Beyonce, These women then said, I've seen this show before. I've seen politicians make commitments, and we've all seen talk. They said, how do you turn talk into action? So they set up this committee, and when I was writing the book, I went back to it and got to see it. And they said, we're not going to join the government's committee. We're going to set up our committee and invite government to our committee. And then we're going to make sure that the money flows. And even though the pandemic disrupted that, even though there were times when it looked like things would go off track, because of their efforts and the power of leverage, 4 million girls have now had access to period products that wouldn't have had 6 years ago.
Ministry of Menstruation. I thought I'd hear that before. But it's interesting how you know, here in this country, we're going to get close to some questions in a few moments, but here in this country, of course, I believe and I feel, especially the last several years, this is not a partisan issue at all, is that that disconnect between the voters and the government is wider than ever. We really feel that they come and court us, they want your vote, they want the political power that only you can provide at the ballot box, and they come and they make you all these promises and they seduce you and they have all this advertising and they say all these things, and then they disappear. They do hardly anything that they advertise they're going to do, hardly anything. So this disconnect is very, very powerful right now, because I think Americans are, overall, my interpretation of the kind of nervous breakdown that the United States is in right now politically has to do with they've had enough of this. We want action. We want to know what pressure can be put on this government. You know, there's an election coming, and the choice is clear. Some people might not agree, but I think the choice is clear. But without getting into that, what do you think would be, like for example, I was working with a group of people who their persistence was, in terms of putting it into action, an environmental policy that they felt really would put this into action was, you would mandate, do a test in a region. You'd pick a smaller city. You didn't want to put this impact on a big city and people's lives like New York or Chicago or Miami or what have you. You'd pick a smaller city and you'd say every single construction project that has any federal dollars involved, schools, airports, hospitals, you name it, any public project that this involves federal dollars, you must have a photovoltaic element inside the construction of that building, whether it's panels, with the skin of the building itself. Any fleet vehicles that are purchased in this country that use federal dollars have to be plug-in vehicles. So you're never going to get rid of oil. You're never going to get rid of refined oil, gasoline. You're always going to have gas and oil and products, traditional products like that, to power fire engines, police cars. You know, for emergency vehicles, you're going to need to have that, because you can't all of a sudden say, "Oh, did you plug in the police car, Larry?" You know, and somebody, you have to make sure there's gas and we're ready to go. But these other ones, we said fleet vehicles of every kind, like a company that has fleet vehicles. If you have hundreds of vehicles in a parking lot, you have your salespeople, they all have to be plug-in. You know, there were answers that these people were telling me that sounded so exciting. What do you think, what's the hope, what's a change you think we can hope for in the coming, whoever is in office, the coming administration? What law could change?
Look, I think, and by the way, if anyone in the audience has answers to this or questions, feel free to help us out in the Q&A. Look, my view is this, you know, the Inflation Reduction Act, you know, and people can criticize it, they can say, you know, whatever they want about it, but it was a great example of, after decades of those in the environmental community coming together to get a big win. And there were many great things in that bill, which not everyone agrees with, right? That is already seeing America peak its emissions. And if just some of that stays intact and the integrity of that, America, you know, we may not get there in time. We have to accelerate in a few areas. We still have 200 coal plants across the country, which we have to figure out how to shut down in a way that doesn't demonize and alienate coal workers, trade unionists, and bring them along for.
And the power shortage.
Yeah, and the power shortage, because everyone, fundamental responsibility of a government, and I see this in Africa, literally if you put a map of the world at night, Africa, with the exception of a few countries, it's all dark. If you fly over Africa, because you don't have access to electricity, and it's a government's fundamental responsibility. In our day and age, energy is life. You need that. But to answer your question around what gives me hope is that there are areas within that where you can make common cause. I was so fascinated by the Inflation Reduction Act. We had campaigned on that. We had citizen advocates get involved. But I knew there were people who'd been involved for decades. And so I went out and I interviewed them for the book. And one of these guys is the president of American Forests. And this guy is like tree expert, loves trees. You can look at a tree and tell you what it is, regardless of where it is. His name's Jed. And I said, Jed, like, how did this come about? And he told me a story that, like, in 2008, 2009, the last time there was an opportunity to pass comprehensive climate legislation, he said, we all went up there and we fought amongst ourselves, the environmental community. He said those who were campaigning for an end to coal, oil, and gas, they looked at us trying to save the forests or protect the forests. They accused us of greenwashing. This is what he said. They said, all you guys are a distraction to what really needs to be done. And he said, so we missed that whole opportunity to get that bill. And I said, well, what did you do? And no joke, he goes, well, we decided to come together next time there was an opportunity. We're not going to let that slip through our fingers. And he said, we went out, he goes, we got, in his words, we got some of the far left crazy ones. We brought them in. We got some on the right who won't even talk about climate change. They use words like conservation, biodiversity. We got everyone together and we organized retreats. He said we even organized sleepover parties, which would have been hilarious to be at. And he said the coolest thing is in the end, we walked up to DC as the most diverse cohort ever assembled in the history of environmental activism. And just one example, he was trying to get communities in inner city America on board. And I do think that word community is key. And the way how he did it is they pioneered this thing called tree equity. And he said, okay, as America warms up, you go to inner city urban areas, and literally often you can see that where tree coverage, right, exists, it often mirrors socioeconomic lines. So in poorer areas, they have less tree coverage. And those areas that are wealthier have more tree coverage. And of course, trees is one of the best ways to reduce the impact of heat. And so they mapped this all and they got communities who had never seen themselves, to your point, citizens, who were so far removed from Washington, so far removed from climate change, never saw themselves in the story. And they said, this is how it impacts you. This is how it's relevant when trees literally sit outside of your home. And one of the hidden stories of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, is that it had billions of dollars to literally reforest cities and communities across America.
Are they doing it?
Yeah, they're doing it. And this is following more than 1.5 billion, because now this is the exciting thing. That same cohort, it's very easy to do accountability here. My wife, not in all areas, my wife 2 years ago requested, we live in Brooklyn, New York, and you can ring the council and ask for a tree. And we're still waiting for a tree. A month ago, we thought it was coming because there was this hole, and she said, oh, they're finally putting a tree in the ground. And then actually they were just covering up the hole. So in areas of Brooklyn, we still have some work to do. But in other places, it's actually the ultimate test of accountability, because you can see the tree in your community, everyone can report back on it. And this is happening. And this is an area which Democrats, Republicans alike actually agreed on. It was one of the few areas when Donald Trump was president, in his State of the Union address, he actually spoke about trees. It was one of his signature policies.
Before we go to questions, I just want to mention quickly that, out here, in the years I've lived out here, I got a house out here. I rented back in '82 and bought my first house in '87. I know there's a lot of people out here who've been out here much longer than I have, but I had a place out here for a little while, and that environmental legacy of this area is so powerful. People out here, they care so much. They fought so hard and raised money for, when I first came out here, Nature Conservancy for larger parcels. Then it transitioned into Peconic Land Trust for large parcels and smaller parcels. Not just the preservation of open land, but just zoning policies and things. People out here care very deeply about the not just the semi-rural complexion of the area, not just the clean water, not just the animal migration and Native American artifacts, whatever the 5 primary rules are for land reserve out here. But just the whole culture out here, ever since I've been out here, is so caring, and I've always been struggling on how to help people to coordinate what their efforts can be, because you live out here and some people will say, it's going to be waterfront property on Bluff Road in a couple decades. We want to be able to have at least a chance to fight that. We want a chance. We may not win everything, but we want a chance to fight that because in my industry, and with people that I know, and beyond that industry, I shouldn't say just my industry, people are all like up in Canada blind buying their climate change property. We're all going to a location where they're going to be less impacted by potential climate change. Vast tracts of land where they can grow food. They're talking about growing their own food. All this craziness, some people say, "Oh, I just bought 1,000 acres in Ontario." I'm like, okay.
And where they can get insurance.
Right, where they can get insurance. Do we have any questions? I'll write on the end there.
I don't know where my voice went, but I know a lot of people. I know a lot of people who try to do things in Africa, and they've given up because of the corruption and the wars among all the people. And I'm wondering how you keep your hope up. You keep at it.
Look, I've been fortunate enough to work, and I've been going to Africa a lot, like probably too much if you ask my wife. We have a 9-month-old daughter, and we're blessed right now because her parents are with us, and so able for us to do this together. But I've been in Ghana, Abidjan, Cote d'Ivoire, literally in the last few weeks. And the thing I would say is, in Africa, there's two scenarios, because people don't realize this, but by the middle of this century, 1 in 4 people on the planet will be African or of African descent. People talk about China and they talk about India, but Nigeria alone will overtake China as the second most populous country in the world. That country alone will have more than 1 billion people. 70% of the continent is already under the age of 30. This is like an extraordinary opportunity for the world if you get this right. In the same way that when China rose, it lifted millions of people out of poverty. If this is done right, it could be incredible. And the thing is about young people, and all the marketing people will tell you this, young people, why do you always look to where young people are? Because they drive trends. They drive the food we consume, the music we listen to, the culture we consume. So I go around, and one thing I will say is the young people I meet in Africa, where do I get that hope? They give me confidence, because one thing I've noticed when I go and speak I've been doing a lot of university talks. When I'm in London, Cambridge, or here in New York, I spoke at NYU, I spoke at Columbia, I always notice this disconnect, because I'll meet particularly like young men who's maybe 20, and they're telling me, this is in New York, about how the world is going to be so much worse than it is today. They don't see themselves as a future. Literally, my wife and I, 18 months ago, was on our honeymoon, but delayed because of the pandemic, separate story, but there we were in Kenya. And this young guy reached out to me on Instagram. He said, I saw you're in Kenya. Can I come and meet with you? And this guy was so fired up, and I met all of his friends in Kenya. And they were contributing to the solution of climate change. And they said, they showed me the coffee farms that they were doing. They showed me the jobs. They showed me the vision, basically, to have coffee across this valley, how it could create jobs, because only 1% of the world's coffee comes from Kenya or East Africa. And it was inspiring. And this one young guy, right, 6 months later, I find out he's been appointed to the President's Youth Advisory Council. In Kenya, people don't realize 92% of the country is powered by renewable energy. And it's incredible. And so you see this youth, you see this potential. The flip side of that is, what ultimately ends extreme poverty? What do people need to be meaningful? You need jobs, right? And the challenge right now, over the next 20 years, currently there's only enough to supply 400 million jobs. Well, you need about 1.2 billion jobs. So that's 800 million jobs we need to find. One of the exciting things we're doing at Global Citizen, we've always said the arts and the creative industry, like the Hamptons International Film Festival, like the work Alec does, this is important to mainstream. But across Africa, Africa's been the second fastest growing continent for the last 2 years when it comes to music, right? It's incredible. And the revenues from music. And so what we've now embarked on is, could we create Africa's first live events international tour? We launched it last year in Rwanda with Kendrick Lamar and PG Lang, created 1,000 jobs. There's no reason why in 20 years' time, the biggest artists in the world, the biggest music acts, would not just be coming from Africa, but touring through Africa as well. So there's a lot of opportunities, but of course you need the infrastructure, you need the investment. And I think for America, this is in America's self-interest. America's development aid budget, it's like a fraction of what we spend on the military. Like I think we spend $800 billion a year on military and defense. We don't spend anywhere near that when it comes to investment in Africa, in energy, in infrastructure. But in terms of bang for buck, if we can do that, if we can supply jobs, then this is going to help everyone. But it's those young people I meet, because people talk about we're in an age of despair. We're not in an age of despair when you speak to these young people. They're proof that action is the antidote to apathy and indifference. And like the Minister of Menstruation, they're just going out and making it happen. It's incredible.
I wanted to mention that obviously you look around and certainly most of the people in this room are north of 40. And I'm saying that because for me, a real key component is young people in education. I met with Mario Cuomo years ago. We wanted to have, when they were going to pass California, this is in the 80s, they passed a big green bill where they were going to raise $1 billion, a lot of money back then was $1.1 billion. And we wanted to have the environmental, I'm missing the word, the middle word, something act, where they were going to, the Republicans in Albany and the Democrats fought over $400 million of it for construction projects and $800 million of it for passive programs like land acquisition and so forth, water resources. And the two parties went back and forth and it was a stalemate. But Cuomo said to me, you got to remember, you can't just order the teachers' unions to teach them. They've got to be trained. It's a negotiation with the teachers' unions. You want environmental studies taught in school, in public schools, which I think is a fabulous idea, is to teach young people, all of their responsibilities as citizens in that way. But he said, you just can't snap your fingers and make it so because the teachers have to be trained and blah, 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 blah. It's an expense. And but I'm such a big fan of that idea of getting young people at the earliest reasonable age to get involved in that kind of a cause. We have time for another question right here. No, you were next. I'm sorry. You're after that. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Baldwin. I have one comment, if I may, and two questions. Sorry, thanks. Nice to see y'all. Thanks for sharing your time and energy with us. The first comment is with all respect, a little bit of pushback on the idea of electrifying everything in terms of vehicles. I believe it was the CEO of Toyota, who I read in the Wall Street Journal, in his understanding and belief, the hybrid electric and gas were more energy efficient in the long run than the purely electric vehicles. And it's not to demonize any perspective or anything like that, but I figure he knows more about cars and batteries than I do, even as a Yale graduate, etc. But anyhow, that was a pushback that hybrid may be preferable to. I need to know more about that. Two, question for the author. How do you share this message and concern around the environment with countries like China, India, maybe Brazil, who, in my perception, their priorities are desperately scraping up out of extreme poverty on a mass scale and say, look, do this clean energy stuff. When the clean energy stuff, as far as I understand, is a lot more capital intensive. And how do you share the concern? And I'm concerned too. I ride waves. I don't need to get into my environmental bona fides, but I care and I take action accordingly. That's and then I have one more question, if I may, after that.
Why don't you ask the second one now?
The second one, I hate to say it, but it's an acting question, if I may. And if this is not the time or place for that, I know we've chatted at the Whalers Church before, and I've seen you at the Mass over there. If this is not the appropriate, if it is, I'll ask, and it's not. Do you have any advice? I took a Meisner technique course in the city, and I'm north of 40, and I've done a lot of different things with my life, and that was kind of, you can hate and condemn me and judge me as selfish, and et cetera, but that was the third question.
I think that's a long answer to that because it's a very different kind of time right now from when I started, And I would say, I would tell people when they say, what's your acting advice? I say, go to law school.
I did did that, so.
Then you're way ahead of the curve. You're ahead of the curve. One more question, we're gonna go over
I
here.
wanted to hear the answer if you.
I will. Why don't we take your question, and then we can answer them all together, but.
Okay. Is there any correlation between what seems to be a pernicious spread of microplastics into living organisms and climate change that you know of?
Yeah, very much so. So I think, do you want to respond to any of these? Or do you wanna...
Well, I mean, the issues that I was concerned about, we talked about this, the ones that previously were anti-nuclear utilities I was involved with for decades, here at Shoreham and BNL, so forth, campaign finance reform, and now my new one is microplastics. And I feel like, I think everybody knows the answer is to ban single-use plastics.
But is there any specific correlations going on that you know of?
Oh, I think plastics is like, it's literally made from petroleum, right? So I think, in fact, there's this wonderful, look at Plastic World, and there's this whole movement around banning not just single-use plastics, but we were talking about this before. I used to think, I'm not a plastic expert, but as I've got more involved in the fossil fuel industry and climate change, I used to think that recycling was one of the best things we could tell people to do. And I was telling Alec this before. For all of the amount of hard work we put into getting people to recycle, in Europe and in the UK, apparently that peaked at 9% of the population. Here in America, apparently it peaked at 6% of the population. Now you might say that if you're at home and you're recycling, then God bless you, and you might say, that's great, I can't believe others are doing that. But here's the thing that really surprised me. When you actually look at what happens with that recycling, this is what I didn't realize. Like, there's lovely old ladies in Germany who diligently recycle. A lot of that either ends up in landfill or shipped out to developing countries. And I can tell you, I've been to the beaches of Ghana and West Africa, and I've organized volunteer drives with young people to pick that plastic up from the beach, and it feels like a drop in the ocean because it just comes back and back. And the reality is petroleum based plastics, which is all of it, is, I think someone showed me a statistic. If you measured that in terms of emissions from a country, it would be something like in the top 5 emitting polluters in the world. So it is 100% linked. The exciting thing about this is if we can wing ourselves off, there's all of these exciting entrepreneurs. Now, there will never be a single product that replaces plastic, but there are a number of different products that can be used to replace building materials, iPhones. Someone reached out to me the other day. I don't know if it works. They're going to send me a copy. Mycelium mushroom-based headphones that you put in your ear, which is apparently much better for you in skin contact. So I think it's a huge issue. But since even writing the book, I've met entrepreneurs around the country that are working on this. The biggest issue they face, though, is that they lack policy. Like a lot of these entrepreneurs who are creating these alternatives to plastics, these products, say that they can't compete because plastic is so cheap. We've made it so cheap right now. And this is why they're saying, how do we regulate this? How do we get the right policies in place? And how do we make sure that the incentives are there? Because I can tell you, a mycelium-based headphones, which is really cool, it's probably going to cost a lot more than anything Apple gives you, and that's already pretty expensive for most folks. Well, it's for me anyway. And to come to your question here, Alec and I were chatting about this before. And, I think that is the biggest, he actually asked me, what is the biggest challenge I see for climate change? And the challenge was actually what you laid out there. I actually think America, if we can hold it together, if we can do a few things to speed up, I think America is already reducing its emissions. The biggest issue around the world is you've got not just China, you've got India, you've got Indonesia, you've got Nigeria, you've got different parts of the world. And the challenge right now is for many of these countries, the incentives, China's a little bit different because it is actually investing a lot in renewable. It has to deal with its consumption of coal power, but it's invested a lot in renewable. But the challenge for many of these countries is access to fossil fuels is just so darn cheaper. And one thing, and this was my issue with the environmental issue lobby, and this is why I ultimately got involved in this issue. If the deal we give to countries who are living in extreme poverty is essentially that to adapt to climate change, it means you have to keep your poor people living in poverty, that is not going to work, because no country or leader is going to sacrifice the welfare of their citizens on the altar of climate action.
And in fact, the opposite is true. They want us to sacrifice.
Exactly.
What sacrifices are Americans and industrial society is going to make? Well, we made sacrifices before. What sacrifices would we be willing to make in order to save the climate?
Exactly. And that's where access to money comes in. Me and Motley, this is where we need to change the world banks. And again, I was saying before, though, that and there's some ideas in the book, so I encourage you to read it if you really want to do it. But this is where there actually are solutions on the table. And again, America spends $800 billion on military and defense. For a country like Barbados, which has natural assets like gas, which it needs for the welfare of its citizens, right, that's a drop in the ocean for America's economy. So these are the discussions we need to have, but ultimately it's in all of our interests to wean off climate change. I do, Alec, just want to say one thing, if we're close to wrapping up, because I want to both comment on your perspective on this, give you the opportunity to respond. I was waiting until the end. I was going to do this at the start, but I know people were still coming in. The Hamptons International Film Festival has done an incredible job, and my wife and I, Wendy, and by the way, I keep on calling her out, but where are you, Wendy? She's standing at the back, or she's somewhere. There she is, right at the back there. We should give her a round of applause. She helped organize a lot of this. But, you know, the International Hamptons Film Festival, we've been watching all the films over the last couple of weeks. And I think the messages that you've heard today about leverage, about popular culture, you only have to go to those films to see it. You know, there's movies about JR, the graffiti photographer from France, who literally shows you how by putting people's faces on buildings has changed policy. There's movies in there about like the Revolution on Canvas that just came out last year, which actually shows the story of popular culture, often inspiring citizen activism. And I think the spirit of the International Film Festival itself is how you use popular culture and that leverage to change these issues. But also, you know, I've always recognized for me that the 8 principles in the book is to give people a start. Eleanor Roosevelt said, the best way to begin is to begin. And I think this is where popular culture comes in, to give people an entry point. So I just want to give, you know, Kim, Amy, you guys a huge shout out for organizing this. And I also want to say that Foundation Source, which is an incredible advisory that's helping philanthropists guide their work, you know, thanks to a donation from them, it means that any book you buy tonight, 100% of the profits will come back to the East Hampton Library. So if you do it, you're not making me wealthy, you're making the library wealthy. Happy to sign it. And lastly, I want to throw back to you, Alec, to reflect, because you and your wife and your foundation, and you were telling, I mean, you've been involved for 30 years, and I just want to say, yeah, I feel honored when they told me that you would be interviewing me. You know, honored to have someone with your experience on this, because I talk about policy entrepreneurs, and I think we'd all agree that Alec's life is the living, breathing embodiment of that.
Thank you very much. It was great talking to you, by the way. I have friends here from the board, Tony and Judy, and of course Kim. We have other members of the board here. Okay, let's point out every member. Yeah, there we go, Karen. We have a lot of people here from the film. The film festival begins Friday, October 4th.
Yes.
The film festival begins Friday. I knew one of the board members would know the correct answer to that question. Friday, thank God. Friday, October 4th is the film festival. There's nothing like these films to burn into your memory, to burn into your mind the realities of these issues. In 2009, our first year, we screened The Cove from Luis Ajayos, his documentary premiere. I think it was his debut. He never made a film. He was a sound technician in films, if I recall correctly. And in 2009, 15 years ago, Ajayos, we presented The Cove here as part of the Summer Docs program, the initial year of the Summer Docs program. The following March, I hosted the Oscars with Steve Martin, and we handed Ajayos the Academy Award for Best Documentary on TV. It was one of the most thrilling moments of my life. And those films, and The Cove, of course, makes you want to run up and go fly to Taiji, Japan, to go fight this issue, the way that these dolphins were treated. Nothing stays with you more than these films, nothing. You can watch programs on CNN, you can watch the news, you can read, there's a lot of great sources for information, but there's no greater source than the films that we show at the Hamptons Film Festival in the documentary category. I have a lot of friends here I want to say hi to, but today is my daughter's 11th birthday, and I'm running home to her birthday party right now, out that door right now, to go home with my family. My wife's gonna yell at me if I don't get home for my daughter's birthday. But thank you again to Amy and Lena and Kim, everybody from the library. Thank you all for coming. Thank you. Thank you to Michael Sheldrick. Michael Sheldrick, everybody.